All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Hassan, and I'd like to welcome you to today's installment of the 2024 Spring Webinar Series for the Safeguarding Democracy Project here at UCLA Law School. I want to thank Harley Ham and Ben Austin DeCampo for their important logistical support today. And I want to tell you about an upcoming program of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. The program is free, but registration is required. On Tuesday, April 9th at 12:15 p.m., both in person at UCLA Law School and online, I will moderate a discussion entitled Race and the Risk of Election Subversion, featuring Matt Barretto of UCLA, Sophia Lynn Lakin of the ACLU, and Spencer Overton of the George Washington University School of Law. This event and all past events are recorded, and the video is available on the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, which is safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. All of our events are free, but registration is required. Today, we're pleased to feature a webinar entitled Business's Role to Prevent Democratic Backsliding. I'm now going to introduce our speakers, and our moderator. Ben Ginsberg is the Volcker Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a nationally known political law advocate representing participants in the political process. His clients included political parties, political campaigns, candidates, members of Congress, state legislatures, governors, corporations, trade associations, PACs, vendors, donors, and individuals. He represented 4 of the last 6 presidential nominees. His academic background includes being a lecturer in law at Stanford Law School, an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and a fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Richard Eidlin is National Policy Director at Business for America. Richard has worked for more than 35 years at the intersection of business, politics, and policy. His career has spanned the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, domestically and internationally, and involved a range of leading-edge issues, including sustainable economy, democracy, and clean energy. He has served as Business for America's Policy and Membership Director since 2018. In 2009, he co-founded the American Sustainable Business Council and served as Vice President for Policy for 10 years. Daniella Ballou-Aares is the founder and CEO of the Leadership Now Project, a national membership organization of business and thought leaders committed to fixing American democracy. Daniella began her career at Bain & Company, working across the firm's offices in the US, South Africa, and the UK. From there, she became a founding partner at Dalberg, where she led the Americas business and transformed the startup into the largest social impact firm with 25 offices worldwide. She spent 5 years in the Obama administration as the senior advisor for development to the Secretary of State, serving under Secretaries Clinton and Kerry. Today's moderator is Richard Pildes of NYU Law School. Rick is one of the leading scholars of constitutional law and a specialist in legal issues concerning democracy. A former clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall, he's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute. He's also received recognition as a Guggenheim Fellow and a Carnegie Scholar. President Biden appointed him to the President's Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. In dozens of articles in his acclaimed casebook, The Law of Democracy, he has helped to create an entirely new field of study in law schools. Pildes has successfully argued voting rights and election law cases before the United States Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, and is a well-known public commentator. Thank you all for taking time today. We appreciate you coming out, and I'm going to turn the program over to Rick Pildes.
Thanks very much, Rick, not just for helping to host this session, but for the whole Safeguarding Democracy Project out of UCLA, which I think has been doing great work already in its relatively short lifetime. And thank the panelists who are here. I should say one of our guests is going to remain off camera due to a recent surgical procedure. So I hope you are appreciative of his being able to be here. So I wanted to start this off by saying that what we're going to talk about today is a much underappreciated aspect of shoring up the American election system, providing support for the integrity of the process, for helping to protect the process against various kinds of threats and challenges we realize the election process now faces. In many of the discussions I've been in over the years, we rarely talk about the role that business can play, has played, should play in helping to shore up the integrity of the democratic system in the United States. So I think this is an incredibly important topic that we talk about far too little, at least among those of us who work on election reform and election law issues. So I'm very excited that we're going to have an opportunity to discuss this with people who have worked with business leaders from a number of perspectives on these issues. So let me just start off at sort of the broadest level. And Richard, let me put this question to you initially. Why is business concerned now, or why should business be playing a role in trying to kind of shore up the integrity of the election system, to help try to build confidence in the election system? Why is this an issue for business?
Right. Good. Yeah. Thanks, Rick. And thanks to UCLA for hosting this conversation. Rick, I think the reason fundamentally is that businesses have been asked by their employees to provide them with trusted, reliable information about how to participate in our democracy and in the election process. That is a trend that has really grown dramatically since 2020, or really since 2016. And companies recognize that a lack of trust and faith in the election system not only creates polarization within the workplace, which affects them in a negative way. It makes it difficult to create a sense of teamwork and collaboration. But a lack of faith and trust in the election system also depreciates our economic performance. So there's both a series of social, cultural reasons, workplace-related reasons why businesses care about the election process. And then there is a broader sort of self-interest around economic and political stability that is driving companies to take these actions.
Danielle, let me ask you that question as well. I want to, we'll get into the specifics of what various figures have been doing from the business community in a second, but just to sort of at this broad level, I think helping people understand or think about whether there is a role for business here. What is the role? Why is this new? Is it really only since 2016 that business has been kind of trying to engage these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I mean, building on Richard's point, the business are being asked to engage, but the reality is that business and business people have always had a role and influence in the political system in multiple ways. I mean, it's the largest sector of society. Most people work in businesses, and the influence on the political system, for good or for bad, right? Regardless of how, even if you are not comfortable with how business engages sometimes in the political system, business is influential because it's a big employer, it's the biggest part of our economy. So I think what I have always been concerned with is when you have an erosion in democratic norms, if those who have the power to both make clear what our society expects in terms of the functioning democracy are not playing a role in protecting it, that's risky. And that's, of course, what you've seen in history, whether it's Nazi Germany or in more contemporary examples of Hungary or Turkey or otherwise, where business is more comfortable kind of staying out of it, not addressing the erosion of democracy early, and then ultimately pays a very profound cost, not just the overall society, but if you look at a country like Hungary right now, if you disagree with the government, if you look at obviously Russia or Turkey or elsewhere, you're going to get kicked out of the country. You could end up in jail. Only those who are friendly with the government succeed. So I think the risks and what's at stake are, very significant, and is the self-interest in acting is significant, as is the societal interest.
I think we should also have both you and Richard say a little bit about your organizations and who they represent. So Richard, maybe if you could just give people a little bit more context. What kinds of businesses are part of Business for America? What is its general role?
Yes. So Business for America is a national business membership organization that's focused on the effort to increase political stability, strengthen our democracy, promote civic health, and work on nonpartisan political reform. We work at the state and federal level, and our members are individual companies such as Salesforce and Cummins, Cushman Wakefield, Warby Parker, Patagonia, and large and small companies who have all decided that they need a forum within which to explore what their role can be. And we have, Rick, a 501c3 and a C4. The C4 allows us to advocate on specific public policies. We make a real effort to support legislation that has bipartisan support. We don't endorse candidates. We try to stay out of the partisan fray and look at the common good, or trying to position business as a third side in the debate. Because we recognize, as Daniella said, business is critical to the functioning of our economy and our society. Many people still trust their employer. They may be skeptical about business writ large, but we work to position business to be a constructive actor in what is increasingly a polarized country.
And Daniela, if you could say a little bit about leadership now, and who are the participants, or what types of businesses or business leaders participate?
Absolutely. So Leadership Now is a membership organization of business and thought leaders who are committed to protecting and renewing American democracy. And so our structure really is focused on the individual leader. We have members in more than 20 states, and we are built off of initially MBA alumni networks, starting with Harvard, but now more broadly. So our members are, both looking at I think we try to ground all of our work in the academic research around democracy, its importance to business and markets, and its importance to our society. And then, we are structured, though, to take action against those principles. We are a 501c4 membership organization. We think that membership organizations have been a powerful force. Everyone from the NRA to the NAACP to Chambers of Commerce and the AARP are all membership organizations. And ours as individuals means that the CEOs and executives in our membership are thinking about their role both in relation to their company, but also as citizens, as credible actors in society right now where trust is incredibly low, and business leaders are relatively more trusted and often not seen as just pure partisan actors, right? They're seen as having a stake in a broader society. So, we in some states, we have chapters that are collectively active in that state beyond the national level. Wisconsin is an example of that. And our members in Wisconsin publicly speak to the importance of stable elections. They'll do amicus briefs supporting when there's action that's going against, for instance, the head of elections, and have been really, willing to be publicly and privately engaging with their peers in the business community and with political actors to stand up for this right in the system. And I can share more later on examples.
Okay. Ben, if I can bring you into the conversation, you're not a business leader, you're not the head of a business organization, but you've moved into this space in a particular way recently. And why don't you tell the audience what you've been doing with the business community and why you think this is a productive role for business leaders to play, the role that you've been kind of cultivating with them.
Happy to, Rick, and thank you and Rick Hassan for having me here today. So business leaders play a particular role in both the country as a whole and individual communities. And in a broad sense, as Daniella said, when countries have undergone backsliding from democracy, it has historically been the business community that has been among those who sort of rescue the democracy. On a far more local level, it's self-evident that business leaders in local communities are the most trusted voices. So the group you're referring to is called Pillars of the Community. which I co-chair with my Democratic colleague, Bob Bauer. And we are animated by the fact that if you have a situation where 30% of the population doesn't believe in the reliability of election results, you have a big long-term problem. And while this is very much voices coming from the right today, the thought experiment is what happens if the former president is elected narrowly, and how peaceful and how reliable are election results after that. So what Bob and I are doing is going into the 5 most contentious election jurisdictions in the country and recruiting the pillars of the community, which is people from various sectors, non-political people, non-former office holders, but people who are leaders in their community with groups behind them. That certainly and prominently features business leaders. We want to recruit these people from across the political spectrum to be willing to take a tutorial in the election system, to kick the tires of the election system, to examine the safeguards and flaws, and then report back to their constituencies and to their communities on the reliability of the election system. Both Bob and I have been in elections for 40 years. We have been in recounts where you really open the hood of the election system and see precisely how well the engine operates. Elections are a very human system, so there will be mistakes, but it is also reliable in delivering results. And so building up the public confidence in that from people from across the political spectrum and from different key constituencies in the community, especially the business community, is what we are trying to do with the Pillars program.
Let me just pause to say, by the way, that we are going to have time for questions and some dialogue in the last part of this session. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We already have some, but I just want to make sure to mention that to people who are listening. So Ben, can you say more? So you're bringing together these business leaders and other leaders of the community. What role do you see them playing in a, let's say, contentious election in Arizona or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania? How are these resources going to be mobilized? What role are they going to play exactly? They've been educated, I guess, into how the election system operates. They have developed relationships with key election administrators, I gather from what you've said. But how do you envision their role?
Well, in a number of different ways. We're asking business leaders to serve with other elements of the community. So faith leaders, veterans, heads of civic organizations, educators, labor unions, a real cross-section of the community. What we envision them doing is taking the tutorial on the election system, being able to vouch before the election for the accuracy or be willing to discuss the flaws. We found election officials believe in transparency of what they do. And so it will really be a question of the pillars talking before the election about how reliable the system is and the safeguards in it to provide accurate results. And then should there be real doubt about the election results afterwards because charges are made, the pillars will step in and say, we're not counting the election results. We don't know who won, but we will validate the process by which the ballots are tabulated. So you'll go through contests, you'll go through recounts, you'll go through litigation, but we have examined the electoral system and we believe the results as prepared by the jurisdictions are accurate. Now, go ahead and litigate over recount issues, but the basic numbers themselves are accurate.
Now, one of the things that several of you have mentioned that I think is really important here and interesting is that we are in a culture in which it's very hard to find sources of authority that people are willing to trust and that they view as legitimate. So many of those sources no longer are viewed that way by one side or the other, or maybe by a lot of people on both sides. And you've mentioned that business leaders still have a certain amount of trust and a certain amount of credibility, and they may be among the few sources of that that we have in our deeply polarized and kind of toxic political culture. I'm curious to hear more about that. Is that really the case still? We know that the issues about the role of business and its relationship to sort of politics and governance has like many things, has become a little bit more politically charged. There has been, there have been complaints from one side or the other about the role of business. Do you find, and I guess let me direct this to Richard initially, but do you find that business figures do still have this kind of credibility? Why do they still have it? I think a number of you have mentioned that, so I just think it's really critical. I want to hear a little bit more about that. And how do they keep it?
Yeah. Well, again, in our case, Rick, we're speaking about, the company, and within the company, there are individuals that are charged with working on a civic education or a, GOTV effort on behalf of the employees. So those folks, maybe they are in HR or communications or government affairs, are hearing from colleagues that they want reliable, trustworthy, useful information about how the election system works. Those employees are obviously being inundated with false, misleading, and disinformation. Artificial intelligence is going to make a real mess of our election system this time around. So companies recognize that it's, not only in their self-interest because they're hearing from employees, but in society's interest to have better information and reliable information. So just quickly, there are a number of initiatives that are out there that we're part of. One is called the Time to Vote initiative that PayPal, Levi Strauss, Patagonia, Business for America have been organizing, and there are at least 2,300 companies that have now made a commitment to give their employees some time off to vote. That doesn't mean you have paid time off, but it does mean the company has explicitly expressed its support for you, the worker, the employee, to go take some time off, study the ballot, maybe serve as a poll worker as well. So that is an explicit commitment. There are many companies now that are running lunch and learn programs, Rick. We did one recently for Cummins Engine in Indianapolis. They invited their employees. We had several hundred workers show up, from different aspects of the company, blue collar, white collar workers. And we did a series of tutorials on this is how elections work. Here are the fail-safe mechanisms. Here are the types of procedures put in place, as Ben suggested, that minimize problems with the election system. And to your question about whether companies are seen as taking a side or not, there were some snarky comments made online in the chat function during that presentation to Cummins. People suggesting, this is an effort to sway the independent-minded voters to somehow vote for, the Democratic candidate, which, was patently not true. But businesses have certainly been attacked over the past number of years for their stance on election-related issues, going back to, the celebrated cases in Georgia with Coca-Cola and Delta. So there has been somewhat of a chilling effect on companies' willingness to speak up and be public, which, goes back to this concern we and, I know leadership now has as well about creeping authoritarianism and sort of a permission structure that is being provided to certain elected officials who feel that it's fair game to attack an individual company, which, is really problematic. So I can offer more on.
Well,
on that.
I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you, so you've
Mhm.
talked about businesses' relationships with their employees, and one can
Mhm.
understand, what the trust issues might be there, education, getting out the vote and the like. But I'm also interested in the sort of external side of
Right.
the kind of work that an organization like Business for America does. Like, I know you've talked to me some about the role that you played in trying to persuade Congress to enact the Electoral Count Reform Act, which Congress ultimately did enact. That's the statute that regulates the vote counting process in the presidential election in Congress. It was a major source of vulnerability in our presidential election process. Some of those there were attempts to exploit some of those vulnerabilities in 2020. Congress ultimately did step up to the plate and create a much more secure structure through this Electoral Count Reform Act. But I know that your organization lobbied on the Hill about that, along with a lot of other actors. What was the reaction of people on the Hill to business groups getting involved in an issue like that? Why did you get involved in that issue? That'd be very interesting, I
Yeah.
think, to hear.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is a good story. And so we brought together in, I believe it was February of 22, a number of businesses, which included Marriott and Salesforce, PepsiCo, Cummins, and a few others, that met with 9 Senate offices, all Republicans, because those were the offices we needed to persuade. And Rick, the most compelling argument that our colleagues from these companies made was that we needed to have a clear set of rules by which the system functioned, because without a clear set of procedures and rules about how the president and vice president were to be certified, it caused or would cause a great deal of market instability, which would prompt some of those companies to see the United States as, a less than favorable place to invest in. And the argument that we made that day was about political stability. Some of the offices we met with were initially quite skeptical about woke corporations showing up in their offices to advocate on behalf of political stability. And there were some testy moments in some of those meetings with chiefs of staff and a few senators themselves. But I think we got through to them that we weren't there in a partisan capacity, but we're really trying to stabilize the system so that, whether it was Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, that we have a clear set of rules that couldn't be manipulated, because that would provoke great chaos in the market. So the political stability argument really held sway that day. And I think we had some impact, on persuading some of those Republican offices to vote in favor of the bill. Last thing I'll mention is we worked very closely with Senator Susan Collins's office, who, helped to tutor us a bit on some of the framing and some of the arguments that she thought would persuade her Republican colleagues.
Daniella, can you speak to this issue? Richard just kind of mentioned it, but it's such a huge issue now. How do business leaders navigate the sort of tension between wanting to support the integrity and the stability of the political system, the political process, support election administrators and the like, and avoid seeming to become partisan actors, which I assume most business leaders would prefer to avoid, or at least avoid having their companies come to be seen as extremely partisan, and to preserve the credibility and trust that the business community does seem to have, even in a world in which so few actors and institutions have that. How do they preserve that while also getting involved in election stability or election reform types of issues? How do business leaders think or talk about that?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. And first, just on this question of, are business leaders trusted? How are they trusted? I think it's who is trusted. I think it's a nuanced I think we should think about it with some nuance. So, I mean, there's a love-hate relationship with business and its role in and certainly its role in politics, right? Around the general public, around others. So, there's apologies. There is a business when you poll and you look at kind of who's respected, et cetera, one's local business is more respected, local CEOs, et cetera, right? Small businesses, companies that your own CEO, the kind of further away you go, the kind of generic big business is less respected. And so I think what we've really seen is that the credible actors are, sometimes it's valuable to have a national CEO or company or otherwise come out, but really it's often, who in your state and your locality are really credible actors. So for instance, in Ohio, our group in Ohio has been working on both support for the Electoral Count Act, redistricting reform, and that group has included the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, John Pepper, the current founder and of Jenny Splendid Ice Cream, which is, a national brand now, but is Jenny Britton, the CEO is from Ohio. And then 50 CEOs from across the country have signed on to efforts to, for instance, there was an effort to raise the ballot threshold. Our members came out on that, and other CEOs and former CEOs. So that was very credible because it was, wasn't a kind of random CEO, even a big name, that wouldn't have been helpful. It was those that you trusted, cared about the issues in your state at that moment. So I think we should have some nuance in how we think about what really is a trusted CEO, what is a trusted executive, what's a trusted company, depending on the context. Similarly, we find trust within industries. So we have a significant number of members who are in the financial sector. We know who's trusted in private equity, in banking, and hedge funds, right? It wouldn't be a household name to you, but here's someone who's trusted by their peers, who's legitimate, who can engage them on those issues. So I think it's important that we think in that way, not only in business, but in all trust right now, right? Their proximity and kind of your local networks matter. In terms of avoiding being seen as a woke corporation, our overall framework that we're working with right now is around U.S. political risk. And we see 3 risks that are significant for companies as we come to this election. There's election risks, right? We have the risk of a contested election. We have the risk of political violence, et cetera. There's governance risks. So the risk, there's risk that you see erosion of rule of law, you're a victim of political retribution, or that Congress stalls and there's dysfunction. And then there's broader societal risk to your employees, to your consumers, and otherwise. And so, I think a lot of times efforts related to societal issues have just been in that third bucket. What's the societal risk? What's the risk to your employees? And I'm not suggesting that those don't matter, but I'm saying that from almost a fiduciary responsibility of companies, you now need to understand those other risks. So for instance, we have a report card that measures the state of democracy state by state in the country and highlights states, a letter A to D grade, and you can see which states have the greatest risk of instability, of ineffective governance, et cetera, as a result of the democracy conditions. So we've really worked to take this into a board level discussion, a CFO level discussion, which, then the question of are you a woke company or otherwise is much less in that domain. It's not without risk, but.
So you mentioned the risk of retribution. I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to come back to that. But, we have seen retributive acts taken against certain corporations that have gotten involved in political matters at least a number of times now. And I want to hear in a bit how business leaders are dealing with that risk or thinking about that risk. But Ben, what's your perspective more broadly outside of these local business leaders? Can business play a significant role in shoring up the election system beyond just the integrity of the voting process itself, which is what you're primarily focused on, I gather, with the pillars of the community? But in terms of the sort of the larger risks that we're all worried about now, whether it's risks of political violence or other things, how consequential do you think business can be in trying to forestall some of those risks, or how willing are they going to be to push back if some of those kinds of risks begin to materialize?
Well, I think unfortunately, so far, the answer is pretty unwilling. I think that business has a major role to play in sort of moderating bad instincts by political leaders. But as you point out, they've been pretty reluctant to do that. I mean, when you're citing the Electoral Count Reform Act as an example of business being involved, remember that that was something where neither party could figure out what the right answer was, because you never knew the facts on the ground when a contested electoral college vote would come up. How willing has business been to stand up to the charges that elections aren't valid? So I think if you're going to look at the national picture, that is probably not the source of answers for lessening the public discourse. Because on a local level, what business leaders do bring to it is a great credibility that their community and their community's peace and prosperity is within their grasp. And I think especially local business leaders have sort of an intuitive feel for how to tread these waters, because roughly half their customer base and half their employee base are on different sides of the political divide. So business leaders can do a number of really positive things to be able to bring a community together without appearing too overtly partisan, which I think so far has made American business really kind of shy and reluctant. Sorry, sometimes the lights go out, but
Right.
maybe it's because I'm in
Well,
a corporate
sometimes that's
building.
us doing that to you as opposed to it happening on your
Well,
own.
maybe I'm in a corporate building. How do you know what's going on? But I mean, what the employers on a local level who will bring employees, let their employees work as poll watchers and poll workers, and encourage that. Give flexibility to voters, to their employees to take a day off to vote. Don't schedule meetings on election day. Push back against the attacks on their neighbors who are election workers when they get harassed. Some companies are willing, through another nonprofit Bauer and I run called the Election Officials Legal Defense Network, allow their in-house lawyers to help with pro bono legal services for election officials in trouble. Provide space for voting centers and voter registration places. So there are a lot of things business leaders on a local level have a feel for on how to tread the difficult political waters, and are very credible on it because they are so in touch with their communities.
Daniella, when you reach out to try to bring more business leaders into the project of a group like Leadership Now, apart from the ones who are pre-committed and very willing to do it, I mean, how do those discussions go? What are their concerns? How are you able to persuade business leaders to get involved? In your case, my understanding is with Leadership Now, a lot of these people are actually putting themselves out as individuals. I mean, I've seen ads that your organization has run in a state like Wisconsin with local business leaders. So what's that dynamic, to give us a more concrete feel about the resistance, the reluctance, the fears about retribution, the effort to steer the sort of the right course here? Can you say more about that dynamic?
Absolutely. I want to just pick up on one thing on this question of, local business leaders versus national, et cetera, that Ben was speaking to. I overall agree very much that the local leaders are key, but there's even more influence that they have beyond what I think you said, Ben, which is if you take a big company in a state like Wisconsin, which, I mean, it may have a lot of even its consumer base outside of the state, but it's still major employer in the state, et cetera. They're also on boards of their industry associations, and the chambers, on the city partnerships and others. And those institutions are influential politically in the state. And if you have a chamber of commerce and others on the right side of this issue and saying, look, we don't want to see our state to be, as dysfunctional. We don't want threats to election administrators. This is bad for our state. That's also influential. And frankly, we've also seen chambers of commerce on the wrong side of these issues, willing to support election deniers and others. And if you have people on those boards who are saying, wait a second, we need to take this into account, it makes a difference. So I would just say that the business leaders of mid to large companies in a state have very significant influence in the overall political space as well in many states, including a state like Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is a good example where our lead in Wisconsin, who was in the Bush administration, is a veteran, runs a manufacturing company in the state. He teamed up with the other members. There are the Florsheims, the shoes you might have heard of. They have Democrats and Republicans in the state. And, I think the way that they were able to build that group was Anoop I happened to know for many years. We were at Harvard together, and he had been in Wisconsin now for many years, building companies there. And he was able to go out and meet with a lot of his peers in the business community and say, I'm really concerned. And he was credible, I think, particularly credible as a Republican, who said, look, I'm concerned about the state of our elections. I'm concerned about the state of our politics. We as business people have a unique ability to act. Here are some ways we could do it. And it was really retail diplomacy, right? Meeting with your peers, finding those who are like-minded. And I will say that even before you get to the skeptical people, there are many business leaders who are very concerned. I mean, our polling, we've done polling of CEOs and executives. The majority were concerned about the state of democracy, but there's very little kind of set of peers to thoughtfully engage. And the other thing that we do always early on as we're building groups is we'll bring in academic leaders, particularly from within the state, a professor from University of Wisconsin who can look at and compare how Wisconsin's governance is going, what's the state of affairs, et cetera. So bringing those kind of credible experts and getting people to have a framework for how to think about what's going on in the system, we found has then created like long-term engagement, which is when you have that engagement is then you can respond when there's crises, you have the people ready to. The one other thing is I don't think national companies and business leaders should be totally written off. The reality in the 2020 election, we were part of bringing, 300 CEOs before the election to come out for the legitimacy. We were then part of the broader group of the Chamber and Business Roundtable who said, look, we have to respect election results. I think if you have a very serious crisis, you will get a broad set of business actors involved, but we would prefer to prevent that, right? And I think that's what we're all working to do.
Yeah, so speaking of crises, I did want to focus on the national level and outside the election context. So, suppose we have a president who defies court orders, for example, or a president who uses the powers of the government to engage in what's broadly seen as political retribution against particular companies that have crossed wires with the president. Do you think there would be significant pushback in those types of situations from the business community? And now I think we're talking probably more, both local and national, but certainly it would require some national response, I would think. Who would put that together? Is that likely to happen? When we think about the larger challenges to the democratic system, protection of the rule of law, for example, are those the kinds of things business is going to be willing to really stake a stance on, or are they going to be afraid to get involved and be on the wrong side of an administration, even if they think that administration is, running roughshod over the rule of law, for example? Yeah, Richard?
Yeah, I'd say that's an important question, Rick. And what is currently happening is there's an inside and outside strategy here. There are lots of different organizations that are concerned about this question. There are think tanks that Daniella and and Business for America, Leadership Now and BFA work with, who are identifying some prospective threats and risks, and then, some scenario planning is taking place. Very few companies, and I'm thinking of, larger companies, although we do work with smaller companies, few business leaders and companies want to be out front on their own. So there's strength in numbers strategy, which is essential. And there's a socializing process that is happening right now, as we speak, about the ideas of risk being made real to companies. There are plenty of examples that we've seen over the past several years where companies have materially suffered because of a stand they've taken on what used to be a non-controversial issue about how elections are run. So this is not an easy step for companies to be willing to speak out against an individual politician, right? That's very difficult and likely to generate, few rewards and benefits. But what will be important is to talk about the process. And so, there will be a number of statements talking about process and principles, and that we call on all elected officials to, and those running for office, to, not give any kind of encouragement to those who pursue political violence. So the principles that business will get behind, might be influential to some politicians. Other politicians, clearly don't care and will pursue, whatever strategies in their best interest. But I do think that, as the temperature increases this year, there is already a growing recognition of the political risks, the societal risks, the governance risks, and more and more trade associations are beginning to pay attention to this. So there needs to be more pressure applied systemically in order to get more companies and business leaders to step up. It's happening. It's not happening at the pace that I would like, but it is happening.
So Ben, you're kind of a cold-blooded realist, generally speaking. What's your reaction to that? I mean, do you think business can step up in these ways under the kinds of stresses and circumstances that I've been trying to kind of put on the table here? Do you think they will shy away? They won't want to be on the wrong side of an administration that's in power, or will they really, push back when there's been very serious threats to the rule of law, the integrity of our system, if that happens, actually come about?
Well, I think it's very hard to generalize about all of business, because I do think that, there are a lot of individual businesses and a lot of individuals involved in those businesses. So it is tough to say. So far, it is difficult to point to concrete actions that business writ large has taken, aside from putting out joint statements together decreeing something, which honestly in the realm of cold-blooded political impact is about a New York Times article, a cloud of dust, and not a whole lot of impact on the public officials who, in your hypotheticals, are running amok. I mean, I think one of the things that you don't hear discussed, but which is important, is suppose an individual politician does run amok, what can business do? Joint statements are not going to be enough. So I think there has been very little thought about what the concrete steps are that could actually have an impact on a dysfunctional situation. And so I sort of think that until you figure out what you could do, the rest of the conversation is kind of rhetoric.
One of the questions we have, this actually comes from Bart Gellman, who some of you may know, and it's very much on this theme, because he reacted to Richard saying there are think tanks identifying prospective threats and risks. And Bart wanted to hear a little bit more about about that work and about who's doing that kind of work. Maybe Richard, if you could briefly kind of add a little bit to what you said about that a little bit more concretely.
Sure. Yeah, I think a really good example, Bart, is a paper that you can find on Protect Democracy's website, which looks at, what they refer to as creeping authoritarianism or autocratic capture, and making a clear distinction, which I think is really critical, between politics as usual, with a rhetorical attack against big business, such as or big tech, as Senator Warren might make, vis-a-vis singling out a particular company, as former President Trump did the other day about Facebook. So what goes beyond politics as usual and now becomes a very deliberate attack on the private enterprise system of the country. So that is one sort of document that has been helpful in the thinking about mobilizing business and making them aware of the risks, and there are other such, well thought out pieces. I think to Ben's point, this is very, the stakes are very high for companies. And, whether it's 50% or, 52% of pissing one constituency off for another, that reality is very clear. And I think, businesses, many of the companies that chose to stop giving money to the insurrection caucus, after the 2020 election, many of those companies kept their commitment for months and then decided they had to do business with the leadership in the House or in the Senate and change their giving patterns. But more, interestingly so, some companies decided to drop out of the political contribution process entirely. So this is I'm a realist as well, and believe that this is a gradual evolution, Rick. And I just last quick story. I mean, about 4 years ago, when I was making this pitch to one of our most important members, a large multinational corporation, they said, Richard, I thought the responsibility of ensuring the integrity of our election system was responsibility of the League of Women Voters. So he was sort of joking, but he was recognizing that's not the case anymore. I think we're going to need more companies, more business leaders stepping up in the coming months.
Another question that someone asked in the Q&A is, in the fight between Governor DeSantis and Disney, sort of who came out ahead on that? And the relevance of that, of course, is, what does the business community make of that fight? Now that we're a little bit distant from it. Daniella?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. I mean, we did an amicus brief on the behalf of the Disney side of that case, making the case that this was violating the Constitution and free speech, and it was an example of political retribution. I mean, look, Ben, I would disagree a bit with your assessment here that we don't know what business can do, and it's only been blanket statements, although there's been too many statements that weren't backed up by action. But the reality is I do think there was a reason DeSantis started, donor support for him started to cool. Yes, he wasn't a great candidate, but I do think his kind of constant rhetoric against companies and others started to wear thin. And what we've seen is, as I mentioned, at a state level, for instance, the way that business exercises its influence when, the Business Roundtable decides that there's like a tax cut that they'd really like to get behind, right? It's a mix of statements, it's lobbying, it's a PR campaign, they're reaching out to every senator, et cetera. And so I think what we have seen is when behind the scenes industry groups go to political leaders and say, you're going too far, it can have an impact. So not all of this is public, right? And certainly not enough of it has happened. And then there's, there is the public pieces. Our members in Wisconsin, said we want to see every candidates who agree to certify future elections regardless of the outcome. And when they did not, the gubernatorial candidate, in this case, the Republican, refused to do that, they specifically endorsed the Democrats. They went public. The Democratic candidate went public. So I think chambers of commerce changing their endorsements. We've seen that in Michigan, endorsing ballot initiatives, et cetera. Like there is a play to be had that business is part of. That's a very deliberate stake, very deliberate stance on these issues that's happened in some cases and can happen a lot more.
Well, we do know from experiences Ben mentioned early on in other democracies, there have been contexts in which countries face the risk of democratic backsliding, and where the business community actually, if it comes to the table in a kind of a concerted way to push back, has made a difference, can make a difference, because there is that trust and credibility, maybe more at the local level than the national level. It's an incredibly important potential role in the American kind of democratic system right now. One of the things I take away from this is some question about whether this role is being mobilized and organized as powerfully as it might be. You all are significant players in trying to do that. But I think it's important to open up these discussions to a wider audience about the role of business potentially and helping to protect the integrity of our democratic process in circumstances in which we know we face various risks and concerns and anxieties that are not typical in the American democratic experience, at least in recent decades. So I will stop there and turn it back over to our larger host, Rick Hasen and the UCLA Democracy Project, Safeguarding Democracy.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you to Ben, to Daniella, and to Richard. This was a really useful discussion, and my sense is that this is not the last discussion we're going to be having of this as we head into November and to the period between November and January. We used to think of elections ending in November, and I'm afraid that we can just be nostalgic for that. Thank you all. We appreciate it. This event will be archived, and you can go back and watch the recording on the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. Thanks to all of you. We'll see you again for our next event, which will be on the issue of the connection between race and election subversion. Thank you all so much. Have a good afternoon.